There are several different ways to calculate your retirement numbers, and we're going to go over 5 of them in this video. So these are things like when could I retire, how much could I spend, how much do I need, and what if there's a market crash. The reason for 5 different methods is that none of them are perfect. They all have pros and cons. So I want you to be aware of each of them and be able to draw on the strengths of each one whenever you need it. Of course, you can't predict the future perfectly, but we need some type of information to help make decisions. So with each of these different tools, as you use one and then the other, I think you're going to uncover some information and learn how retirement works. So you might notice some risks or opportunities, or you might just get a better understanding of how things might unfold. For the most part, we're focusing on spending from your assets, and that's because most people know what their income is. You know what your Social Security or your pension is, and you can enter that into some of these tools, but you don't know as well how long your savings are going to last and how different factors affect that. So if you earn slightly more on your investments, for example, what's that going to do to your income or the likelihood of success? So let's start with a traditional approach, which is using a spreadsheet or a financial calculator. Now, fortunately, you don't need to know how one of these works anymore. You can use online spreadsheets or Microsoft Excel. The idea, though, is we're going to do these old school calculations like figuring out the future value or what the payments can be. And those answer questions that in plain English sound more like how much money do I need and how much money do I need to save each month to get to that goal. With a spreadsheet, you can really do some surprisingly powerful calculations, and everything just fits in one box, but it covers a lot of ground. So you can back into a lot of these retirement answers if you start with the end in mind. For example, let's say you want to pay yourself $3,000 per month or withdraw $3,000 a month from your savings. You're going to earn 6% on the money you've saved up, and you want to pay yourself for 35 years. Now, how much money are you going to need? First of all, you can figure that out with a present value calculation. And so we have the present value and then some of these inputs, and that tells you that you might need about $528,000, $529,000. Now, we're going to get to some complications in a minute, but for now, we'll keep it simple. And so then the question becomes, how much money would I need to save to get there? So if you're 10 years away from retirement, and let's say you're going to earn 7% on your investments, we find that you would need to pay in about $3,055 per month if you can get all of these assumptions met. And it's always a good idea to triple check. So we can go over to the SEC's calculator and throw in a number that's about the same, 528,000. You're starting with $0 or $1, which is the minimum here, over 10 years with a 7% rate of return. If we hit calculator, it's going to tell us that it's $3,050. That is, of course, the payment function, which is going to help you figure out what the monthly or the periodic payment, you can do monthly or annual or anything else, what the payment into an account needs to be so that you can reach a goal. But we need to make some adjustments because that is an oversimplification. So we can start by looking at taxes. And if we say that you want to spend $3,000 per month, let's say on top of your Social Security, for example, what if that money is in a pre-tax retirement account? Well, in that case, you would actually need to pull more money out of the account so that after taxes, you would then end up with about $3,000 a month to spend. And the way you can figure that out is by taking the amount you want, the $3,000, divided by 1 minus the tax rate. In this case, it's 15%. But if we made it 20%, you can see just with a quick adjustment, that's why these spreadsheets are handy, how you might need to save more, or if it's more like a 10% effective rate. Essentially, you're going to figure out how much you would need to pull out, and that affects the total amount you would need. So we need to kind of go back to the drawing board here. And of course, that affects how much you ultimately need to contribute to the accounts each month. Now, we haven't looked at a case where you actually have some money saved. So going back to the oversimplified version here, ignoring some taxes, ignoring inflation, of course, we're going to say, what if you needed $528,000 at your retirement date, but you already have $100,000 saved? Well, in that case, you might only need to contribute about $1,900 per month because you already have some of that money saved up, and that will hopefully grow at the rate you assume. Another important thing to consider here is inflation. So if we say you want to spend $3,000 per month, but that's not going to happen for another 10 years, we need to adjust your spending for inflation so that you don't lose any purchasing power. So in this case, we might do a pretty simple future value calculation, and that's where we say the amount you want to spend over that number of years based on some inflation rate. That is going to tell you, that's down here at 3%, that's going to tell you that ultimately you probably more realistically need about $4,000 per month. So what you might need to do is then copy this 4,032 up into this box up here, and then start to figure out more realistically the amounts you need to save. Another important thing to know about these basic calculations is they don't necessarily account for inflation once you start spending. So the $4,000 tells you how much you need in that first month of retirement, but we want you to continue increasing your spending so that you can keep up with inflation. There are a couple of different ways to do that. There's just one of them shown here, but essentially it would say that you really need more like 760,000 as opposed to 528,000, and really it's higher if you copy that number up. But you can see that there's a big difference between if you're doing flatline spending that does not increase month over month or year over year versus an inflation adjusted withdrawal. So this increases by the 3% inflation rate every year. And you can do that with, again, another quick calculation, just multiply, and it continues on and on. For all of this to work out, of course, you need to earn at least as much as you assumed in your investment returns, and everything else needs to work out the way you assumed, which is never going to happen. This assumes flatline growth. It assumes level inflation that doesn't fluctuate over time. It doesn't assume, big market crashes that can eat into your savings. If you've heard about that sequence of returns risk, which we will look at an example of in a minute here. So you really need to understand that there are limitations of this. So some advantages of these quick calculations: you can quickly change a number and it instantly updates everything. So that's great for some what if analysis. You can really run through a lot of possibilities quickly and customize it however you want. This can also get really robust and elegant if you're skilled with spreadsheets, so you can do a lot. But on the flip side, it is very easy to make mistakes on spreadsheets, and it's not going to tell you if you made a mistake. It might not even tell you if your plan is running out of money. So you need to be very careful, and you want to make sure you know what you're doing with a spreadsheet. Also, it won't cover things like, let's say, IRMA, or how much of your Social Security gets pulled into your taxes. And of course, you can do that. You can build a spreadsheet that does all that, but that's getting really advanced. And the more complicated you get, the easier it is to make mistakes or to have things go out of date because you need to keep updating all the numbers. So you probably start out with some basic spreadsheets, basic calculations to get a general idea of things, and then you might look at other tools. The other issue with this is it doesn't really paint a picture. It just spits out an answer. It's like a single number that tells you what the answer is. So that brings us to our next method, which is spreadsheet cash flows. We've got an example going already of a spreadsheet cash flow down here at the bottom. So we can say in year one, you might start with a given balance. Then we assume some rate of return. In this case, it's 6%. But of course, you can just, with a couple of taps, change that to any number you want. Then you presumably get some growth in your account. In this case, we are withdrawing the amount you need, and this happens to be, we've switched to annual from monthly, and we're doing it at the end of the period, which might be weird, but that's what we're doing here. So you take some money out. So you've got your starting balance, you add in the growth, you subtract the withdrawal, and you have an ending balance at the end of the year. You copy that over to the next year, and then you just rinse and repeat. And this is nice because it helps to paint the picture for you. You can actually look through all of this and see what's happening. So you can say, well, okay, my withdrawals are increasing each year with inflation. That's great. I get some nice growth each year, and then the growth starts to taper off as the account balance it grows and then that starts to taper off as well. And we've calculated it for exactly 35 years. So this has you reaching zero exactly at the end of year 35. You can also do some interesting what ifs here in the numbers. You can manually adjust things. So you might say, well, what if there's a 10% crash in year 6 here? So we'll just say negative 80,000. And what does that do? As you can see, the growth was up at about 46, 47,000, but that drops off to 41,000-ish. Your account balance is quite a bit lower. And then is that going to affect things? And the answer is yes, you've actually hit some negative numbers here. It ran out of money at some point during year 29. So you have to look closely to notice that. So you want to be very careful as you use these types of spreadsheets, because the withdrawals might continue showing if you don't get fancy with the spreadsheet. And this is just something, I put together in a couple minutes. So you want to be very careful because it may assume that you're still taking withdrawals even when you're out of money. So some advantages of this method, again, it's kind of more visual and you can spot check, and sometimes it will show you when things are running out of money, like we just looked at, or you might notice other things that look wrong or unrealistic. So that's really helpful. You can also, again, make those quick changes to, let's say, the amounts you're going to earn, or you can reduce your spending in the go and slow go and no go years. For example, you can just manually go in there and type in a smaller number, and then it'll inflate off of that, which is really easy and nice. But there are some drawbacks. Again, it doesn't necessarily tell you if you run out of money. It doesn't just spit out the answer for you. You need to actually look and manually see if there are any issues. We don't have taxes in here, for example, but you could add a column for taxes. So again, it's kind of up to you how complicated you want to get. Another approach is to use withdrawal rates. And this is where maybe you've heard of this so-called 4% rule, which is not really a rule. Nobody actually uses it. It's just a research finding that somebody came up with, Bill Bengen came up with long ago, that looked at how much you might spend assuming worst case historical scenarios. But you might not get that worst case scenario, and things may look different in today's world. With the 4% rule, you would spend 4% of your starting account balance each year. So 20,000 is 4% of 500,000, or if you prefer, you can say a million, a nice round number. 4% of that is 40,000. You start with that withdrawal amount, and then you increase it every year with inflation. And you don't necessarily look back at your existing balance every year before you decide how much to spend, at least not with the traditional 4% rule. There are other withdrawal strategies, I guess, where you might decide to stick to a flat rate. That has pros and cons. But with the traditional 4% rule, you're just going to increase with inflation every single year. And the hope is that that would last you at least 30 years. Now, in an example like this, where we have 6% returns, 3% inflation, you're going to have plenty of money left over 30 years. And that's what the original 4% rule was based on. But it also was attempting to address the problem of having bad market returns. So if you took away, let's say you had a $50,000 loss in your investments in this year, that could potentially affect you and have you end up with quite a bit less. And then, a number of bad years would result in you potentially running out of money. So withdrawal rates are a sort of oversimplified way to think of things, but they can be helpful if you're way off that 4%. For example, if you're withdrawing at, let's say, 1%, that's going to be interesting information. So it can tell you maybe you could spend more, or maybe there's something going on you want to pay attention to. On the other hand, if you're withdrawing, 15% or something like that, we need to look at that and say, is this sustainable, or is this just a temporary thing for a couple of years, let's say until you start taking Social Security, for example. So some pros and cons of withdrawal rates like the 4% rule, they just don't really reflect reality. Most people don't spend that way. It doesn't account for, let's say, if you need a new roof or a new car or something like that. It doesn't account for Social Security strategies or Roth conversion type strategies when you're going to delay claiming and spend at a higher rate, because that might benefit you tax-wise and otherwise. It doesn't really adjust over time. other than for inflation. And we know, again, that retirees sometimes use patterns more like the retirement spending smile, where you might spend it slightly less than inflation in the early years, or the go, go, slow go, and no go years, where you're really spending once you stop working, and then that kind of tapers off as you've done more and more of the things you want and you have less desire to be gallivanting all over the globe. That approach also ignores taxes, and it can really cause underspending if you really hover on that 4% number. Again, that was based on some worst case scenarios, and you might or might not have bad luck. We just don't know. It can end up with you leaving a lot of money behind at your death if the markets perform reasonably well. Next, we have a Monte Carlo analysis, and this is where it will tell you you have a certain probability of success. And then you can dial in many different types of assumptions here, and you can even add things like, let's say I'm going to do part-time work or something like that in retirement for a few years. You can really add in a lot of detailed things here, and as you make changes to the plan, or as you just evaluate the plan, you might find that the odds of success change. So in this case, we switched from Social Security at age 62 to age 70. That's not always going to help so much, but in this case, it was helpful. So you can evaluate the odds of success. And what does that mean? Well, a Monte Carlo analysis might generate 1,000 different runs in terms of what the markets are going to do. So this widening cone is sort of the range of outcomes you might have. And in this case, I believe she was at about 89% odds of success. So that means out of every 1,000 different hands of cards, 89% of the time, she would end up with money left over in accounts. Now, you might have the absolute best outcome, probably not. You might have the absolute worst. Guess it's possible, probably not. But your range might be, somewhere in between those two. So you get, again, 1,000 different hands of cards. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. We want to look at all of those and say, how often do you end up losing? And by losing, that's kind of a harsh way of looking at it or defining it. The reality for most people is if they are on the bottom here, they're getting these worst case scenarios over and over, and they're probably going to see trouble coming at some point, and they're probably going to make adjustments. And that's a better way of framing this is instead of calling it probability of success or failure, we might call it probability of adjustment. So if you are having problems, the markets are doing bad, or you took big withdrawals at a surprising time that you didn't want to, and it drew down your account balances too much, you might tighten your belt and you might make some changes, maybe downsize or something like that, so that you can get things back on track. And the other thing to remember here is that failure just means you don't have any money left in your accounts. Now, we want you to have money left in your accounts so that you can use that money for things you need. But it doesn't mean that you have no house. You might still have home equity. You probably still have some sort of income, probably Social Security, for example. So you're not necessarily entirely destitute, but you did run out of money, which can be problematic. One of the challenges with Monte Carlo type things is it doesn't tell you exactly what to do. So you can enter some things here and you can do, I guess you might call it some guess and check. And you say, well, if I did want to have a higher odds of success, and not sure that you necessarily do, we'll talk about that. But what if I work an extra year? How does that help things? You can start running these numbers and tweaking the inputs to start seeing what gets you to an acceptable level. Now, keep in mind that it is tempting to get an A on your test here. Everybody wants to be up in the high 90s. Why would I want less than 100% odds of success? But if you think about it, if you have 100% odds of success, that means it's effectively 100% odds that you are not spending as much as you could have, or that you worked a little longer than you needed to. So aiming for something too high can be problematic. Now, it might be the right thing to do if you just want to protect against every type of bad luck, or if you're completely incapable of making any adjustments. If there's just no wiggle room for whatever reason in your budget, you can't move, you can't cut spending or something like that, then yes, maybe you want to look towards those higher odds of success. But remember that if you end up having a super high odds of success, you're probably spending less than you could have. So some of the benefits of this type of analysis, again, especially with a powerful software tool like this, is that you can really include a lot of interesting things, and it might even look at what your various expenses are, and do you end up paying off a house, or what does your healthcare look like, and are you going to go into IRMA and end up having to pay more each year? You can get a lot of detailed information and see how different changes affect things in your plan. But again, it does kind of set you up for this pass or fail framework where everybody wants to get an A on the test, and again, it can lead to underspending if you do that, and it doesn't really tell you exactly what to do to fix problems. Another method for calculating your retirement income is to use dynamic spending strategies. There's a couple of different ways to do this. One of them might be guardrails. That's one that's gaining a lot of popularity, and it's been around for a while. If you look back at Guyton-Klinger guardrails, that's one way to look at this, where you say, I'm going to start at a higher withdrawal rate than that old 4% guideline, let's say. Might start at 5.5% or something, but you need to be open to making adjustments if things aren't going well. So if your account balance goes down by a certain amount, it hits a guardrail, that means you need to cut your spending. And on the other side of things, if things go well, your account balance grows beyond a certain point, then you can presumably increase your spending. So as you might imagine, the spending amount each month or each year is going to fluctuate, and ideally it goes up, but you need to be open to the possibility of it going down. This is a different version of guardrails, more risk-based guardrails, and this is going to say, let's say you have $1 million when you retire, or today at least. This can be updated, and you'd be looking at, maybe you have $1 million, you're going to spend $4,000, or you're going to withdraw $4,034 per month. But if the account goes down to about $644,000, again, this is telling you how much you need to watch for. If it goes down by $355K or a 36% dip, then you would need to cut your spending by $200, which is roughly a 5% decrease. But if the market goes up, then you could presumably increase your spending by a certain amount. And you can be, more or less aggressive here if you want, and widen those guardrails, making the adjustments behave a little bit differently. But the point being, you can figure out exactly at what point, and you can start to see it coming, at what point you're going to need to change your spending. So it might be helpful to evaluate different historical events like the GFC here. If you had this type of plan set up, you were going to make some cut here going down a couple $100 there, but eventually the spending could go back up until we had a little bit of a problem here in 2022. If you remember, that was a tough year for the 60-40, for example, and so you might need to reduce the income due to something like that. So there are fluctuations. Ideally, they are mostly upward, but it is also possible to have these decreases where you actually need to cut your spending. So again, this can help you start at a higher rate, but it can lead to you needing to make cuts to your spending. So you need to be okay with that. And there are a number of other ways you can adjust your spending, use these dynamic strategies. You can, for example, just skip inflation adjustments or take a number of other steps just to help keep your plan intact. So that helps you figure out a lot of those retirement numbers, but you may still wonder how much you are actually spending now or how much you should budget for in retirement. So what's the right amount? And this video popping up now should help you with that. I hope you found all of this very helpful. If you did, please leave a quick thumbs up. Thank you and take care.